The road was almost empty, the kind of quiet stretch where the world seemed to slow down on purpose. Late afternoon light spilled across the asphalt, soft and golden, catching dust in the air and glinting off the hood of an old sedan moving at a careful, steady pace. Inside the car, an elderly black man drove with both hands on the wheel, posture upright, eyes focused ahead. His movements were unhurried, precise, shaped by decades of discipline rather than fear. The radio played softly, a low murmur of voices he barely listened to. In the rearview mirror, blue and red lights suddenly bloomed like a bruise against the calm. The siren chirped once. Not urgent. Not frantic. Just enough to command obedience. The man sighed quietly and eased the car to the shoulder. Gravel crunched beneath the tires. He shut off the engine and rested his hands on the steering wheel, fingers interlaced. He had lived long enough to recognize moments that carried weight. This was one of them. A patrol car pulled in behind him, angled slightly, asserting control over the space. The door opened hard. Boots hit the pavement. The officer approached with a stride that was too confident, too sharp for a routine stop. His hand hovered near his belt, not quite touching the holster, but close enough to send a message. The man watched through the side mirror as the officer stopped just short of the window. There was a pause. Then a knuckle rapped twice against the glass. "Yes, officer?" the man said as he rolled the window down. The officer's eyes scanned his face, lingering longer than necessary. His gaze slid over the interior of the car, the worn seats, the neatly folded coat in the back, the absence of anything remotely threatening. His lips curled slightly, not into a smile, but something close. "License and registration," he said. The man nodded and reached slowly into the glove compartment, careful to make every movement visible. He handed over the documents with steady hands. The officer took them but didn't look down right away. He stared at the man again, eyes narrowing as if searching for something that justified his presence. "Where you coming from?" he asked. "From town," the man replied evenly. The officer tilted his head. "What were you doing there?" "Running errands." "Errands?" the officer repeated, the word heavy with skepticism. The man met his gaze calmly. "Yes." That calm seemed to irritate him. The officer finally glanced at the license, eyebrows lifting just slightly at the age printed there. He looked back up, surprised but not softened. "You know why I pulled you over?" he asked. "No, officer." "You were drifting," the officer said. "Maybe tired. Maybe distracted." "I wasn't," the man replied. The officer's jaw tightened. "I didn't ask what you thought." A car passed slowly in the opposite lane. The man could feel the tension tightening like a wire between them, thin and ready to snap. The officer leaned closer to the window. "You live around here?" "Yes." "Address match the license?" "Yes." The officer straightened, then walked a slow circle around the car, inspecting it as though it were evidence rather than transportation. He peered into the back seat, bent slightly to look through the trunk window, then returned to the driver's side. "You got anything in this car I should know about?" he asked. "No." "No weapons? No drugs?" His tone sharpened on the last word. "No." The officer exhaled through his nose. "You sure?" The man held his gaze. "I'm sure." That silence again. The officer tapped the license against his palm, annoyed that nothing so far had justified his instinct. He took a step back. "Sit tight," he said, turning away. The man watched him retreat to the patrol car. He could see the officer through the windshield now, typing something into the computer, glancing back repeatedly as if the man might disappear if left unobserved. The radio in the sedan clicked softly as the song ended, leaving only the sound of wind brushing against metal. Minutes passed. Then more. The sun dipped lower, stretching shadows across the road. The man adjusted his posture but did not fidget. He had learned long ago that stillness could be a form of resistance. The officer returned, license still in hand. His expression had changed, hardened. "Step out of the vehicle," he said. The man paused for a fraction of a second, then nodded. He opened the door and stepped out carefully, joints protesting faintly as his feet touched the cold ground. The air felt sharper outside. He straightened his coat and faced the officer. The officer looked him up and down. "Hands where I can see them." The man complied, holding them calmly at his sides. "You always this quiet?" the officer asked. "I speak when there's something to say." The officer laughed once, humorless. "You think you're clever. I think I'm respectful." The officer's smile vanished. "Turn around." The man turned slowly. Gravel pressed through the thin soles of his shoes. He felt eyes on him now. A jogger had stopped further down the road. A woman in a parked car across the street pretended not to stare while very clearly staring. The officer took a step closer, invading the man's space. "You know," he said quietly, "people like you always act innocent." The man's shoulders remained squared. "People like me?" The officer hesitated, then scoffed. "Don't play dumb." A long pause followed. The man's voice, when he spoke again, was low but steady. "Officer, I have done nothing wrong." "That's not for you to decide," the officer snapped. He gestured toward the hood of the car. "Hands on the vehicle." The man complied once more, placing his palms flat against the cool metal. His reflection stared back at him, older, lined with years of responsibility and restraint. He breathed in slowly. The officer lingered behind him, saying nothing, letting the moment stretch. Power, after all, enjoyed being felt. Somewhere behind them, a phone camera clicked on. The man did not turn his head. He did not raise his voice. But inside, a familiar weight settled into his chest, one he had carried for decades, one he had hoped age might finally lighten. The officer cleared his throat. "Who do you work for?" he asked suddenly. "Myself," the man replied. The officer snorted. "Funny." The man said nothing more. Another car slowed, then drove on. The officer seemed to sense the growing audience and stiffened, as if determined to assert control before it slipped away. "Wait here," he said, walking back toward the patrol car again. The man remained where he was, hands still on the hood, the quiet road now charged with anticipation. Whatever this was, he knew, it wasn't over yet. The wait stretched on until time itself felt deliberate, as if the road had decided to hold its breath. The elderly man remained still, palms pressed against the hood, the metal cool beneath his skin. He could hear the faint crackle of the police radio behind him, broken phrases drifting through the air, none of them meant for his ears, but all of them reminding him exactly where he stood. Behind him, the officer lingered longer than necessary, boots scraping slightly as he shifted his weight. The silence was no longer neutral. It pressed, heavy and intentional. "You can relax your hands," the officer said at last, not kindly. "I'm not done with you yet." The man lowered his arms slowly and turned halfway, careful not to make any sudden movements. His expression remained composed, but the lines around his eyes had deepened. They weren't lines of fear. They were lines of memory. The officer glanced toward the small cluster of people who had gathered at a distance. A jogger pretending to stretch. A woman seated in her car, phone held low but angled just right. A delivery driver who had parked on the shoulder, curiosity outweighing his schedule. The officer raised his voice slightly, enough for them to hear. "Sir, I asked you twice if you had anything illegal in the vehicle." "You asked once," the man replied calmly. "And I answered." The officer's jaw tightened. "You correcting me now?" "I'm clarifying." That word landed wrong. The officer stepped closer, invading the space again. "You don't get to clarify anything. You answer questions." "I have answered every question," the man said. The officer let out a sharp laugh. "Funny how you people always think you're special." A murmur rippled through the small crowd. The jogger froze mid-stretch. The woman in the car lowered her window slightly. The man lifted his chin, eyes steady. "Officer, I am asking you to speak professionally." The officer's face flushed. "Oh, you're asking now?" He turned toward the onlookers, gesturing broadly. "You see this? Guy thinks he can tell me how to do my job." One of the bystanders finally spoke, voice cautious but clear. "Hey, man, he's just asking you to be respectful." The officer spun toward the voice. "Mind your business." The man took a breath. It is everyone's business when authority forgets its limits. That did it. The officer's hand shot up, palm out. "That's enough." He turned back to the man. "Put your hands behind your back." The crowd stiffened. Phones came up higher now, no longer subtle. "For what reason?" the man asked. "For obstruction," the officer snapped. "And attitude." The man did not move. Not in defiance. In principle. "I am not resisting you," he said carefully. "But I have done nothing to warrant that." The officer stepped closer still, voice dropping low and sharp. "Last warning?" The man's heart beat steadily. He knew this moment. He had studied it from every angle, debated it in chambers, weighed it against precedent and principle. On paper, it was always simple. On the roadside, it never was. He slowly placed his hands behind his back. The officer snapped the cuffs on tighter than necessary. Metal bit into skin. A small hiss of breath escaped the man despite his effort to remain composed. "Too tight," he said quietly. "Should have thought of that earlier," the officer replied. The humiliation settled in then, thick and undeniable. The murmurs grew louder. "This isn't right," someone said. "Why are you cuffing him?" another voice asked. The officer ignored them all, guiding the man toward the patrol car with a firm grip on his arm. He positioned him beside the open door, deliberately leaving him facing the road, facing the eyes. "Stand there," the officer said. "Don't move." The man stood, shoulders back despite the pain in his wrists. He looked straight ahead, refusing to shrink. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows that stretched across the pavement like silent witnesses. The officer returned to the patrol car again, typing furiously, glancing up now and then with irritation as the phones remained raised. He made another radio call, voice tense, clipped. "Yeah, I got an uncooperative subject, older male, refusing to comply, yeah?" The word uncooperative echoed louder than the truth. The man shifted his weight slightly. The cuffs clinked. The officer's head snapped up. "I said don't move." "I adjusted my footing," the man replied. "Keep talking," the officer muttered. A car pulled over behind the patrol vehicle. Another officer stepped out, younger, uncertain. He took in the scene, the elderly man in cuffs, the small crowd, the charged air, and hesitated. "What's going on?" he asked. "Routine stop," the first officer said quickly. "Guy got mouthy." The younger officer glanced at the man, then back at his colleague. "Sir, are you okay?" "I am being detained without cause," the man said evenly. The first officer shot him a warning look. "Don't answer questions you weren't asked?" The younger officer frowned. "He's pretty calm." "That's how they are," came the reply. "Right until they're not." The words hung ugly and exposed. The crowd reacted audibly now. A woman shook her head. Someone muttered, "Unbelievable." The man closed his eyes briefly, not in defeat, but in resolve. When he opened them again, his voice carried quiet authority. "Officer, I would like to know the specific statute under which I am being detained." The first officer laughed. "You think you're in a courtroom? Every interaction governed by law is," the man replied. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably. "Maybe we should just—" "I've got this," the first officer cut in sharply. The man inhaled slowly. "May I make a phone call?" The officer hesitated. "Why?" "To inform someone of my delay." The officer scoffed. "Who, your lawyer?" "No," the man said. "My clerk." That word again. It landed heavier this time. The officer narrowed his eyes. "You some kind of politician?" The man didn't answer immediately. He met the officer's gaze, unblinking. "I am someone who believes deeply in accountability." The officer stared back, a flicker of doubt crossing his face before pride crushed it. "Make it quick," he said finally, unlocking the cuffs just enough to allow movement but not freedom. The man raised his phone, hands steady despite the ache. He dialed from memory. "Yes," he said when the call connected. "I've been delayed on the roadside." "Yes. I understand. No, do not escalate yet." The officer listened, unease creeping into his posture. The man ended the call and lowered the phone. "Thank you," he said calmly. The officer folded his arms. "You think that changes anything?" The man looked past him, toward the watching crowd, toward the road that had become a stage. "It will," he said softly. The officer scoffed, but his confidence had cracked. He glanced at the younger officer, then at the phones, then back at the man. In the distance, another siren wailed, growing louder. And for the first time since the lights had flashed on, the officer felt something unfamiliar tightening in his chest: uncertainty. The distant siren grew louder, slicing through the tense air like a blade. The officer stiffened, eyes darting toward the sound, then back to the man standing beside the patrol car. The crowd sensed the shift immediately. Phones steadied. Whispers sharpened into expectation. The younger officer glanced down the road, then at his colleague. "Back up?" he asked. "Yeah," the first officer muttered, though his tone lacked certainty now. He cleared his throat and straightened his shoulders, trying to reclaim the authority that had begun to slip through his fingers. The siren faded as the approaching vehicle slowed and pulled in behind the others. It wasn't another patrol unit. It was a dark, unmarked car. No light bar. No insignia. Just clean lines and tinted windows. The door opened quietly. A man stepped out in a tailored coat, movements efficient, expression controlled. He scanned the scene once, taking in the crowd, the patrol car, the cuffs, the elderly man standing with unmistakable composure despite his restraints. He walked forward without hesitation. "Good afternoon," he said, voice calm but carrying. "I'm here regarding the stop." The first officer frowned. "Who are you?" The man reached into his coat and produced identification, holding it out at chest level. The officer glanced at it briefly, then froze. He looked again, closer this time. His face drained of color. The younger officer leaned in, eyes widening as he read the seal, the title. The first officer's mouth opened, then closed. He swallowed hard. The man in cuffs watched silently, his gaze steady, almost gentle. There was no triumph in his eyes. Only patience. "Sir," the newcomer said, turning toward the elderly man. "Are you injured?" "I am not," he replied. "Though I am inconvenienced." The newcomer nodded once. "Understood." The officer finally found his voice. I didn't realize." The elderly man lifted a cuffed hand slightly. Not to interrupt, but to pause the apology before it could become self-serving. "That is precisely the point," he said quietly. The crowd leaned in as one. The first officer took a step back, suddenly aware of every eye on him, every recording device capturing his unraveling. "I was just doing my job," he said weakly. "No," the elderly man replied, his tone even. "You were exercising discretion." "Poorly." The newcomer stepped forward. "The vehicle belongs to him," he said, nodding toward the man. "The address matches? There are no outstanding violations." "There never were." The officer's shoulders sagged. "I thought." "You assumed," the man corrected. The word landed with finality. The officer glanced around, desperate for an ally, but found none. The younger officer stared at the ground. The crowd murmured openly now. "Why didn't you say who you were?" the officer blurted out, frustration cracking through fear. The elderly man's eyes narrowed just slightly. "Because the law does not require identity to be treated with dignity," he said. "And because I wanted to see how you would behave when you thought no one important was watching." The officer flinched. The newcomer stepped closer to the cuffs. "May I?" he asked. The elderly man nodded. The cuffs clicked open. Red marks circled his wrists. He flexed his hands once, slowly, then let them fall to his sides. He did not rub the marks away. He left them visible. The officer stared at them, shame creeping into his posture. "I'm sorry," he said again, softer now. The man regarded him for a long moment. The silence felt heavier than any accusation. "I believe you are sorry," he said finally. "But not for the reason that matters." The officer looked up, eyes glossy. "I don't understand." "You are sorry because you learned who I am," the man said. "Not because of what you did." The words rippled through the crowd like a wave. The younger officer shifted. "Sir," he said quietly to his colleague, "maybe you should." "I know," the first officer snapped, then caught himself. His voice dropped. "I know." The newcomer turned toward the crowd. "This situation is being addressed," he said calmly. "Thank you for your patience." A few people nodded. Some lowered their phones. Others kept recording. The elderly man stepped slightly away from the patrol car, reclaiming the space that had been taken from him. He looked at the officer one last time. "You asked me earlier if I thought I was better than you," he said. "I do not." The officer swallowed. "But I do believe the uniform demands more than suspicion," the man continued. "It demands restraint, fairness, humility." The officer nodded, unable to speak. The unmarked car door opened again. Another individual stepped out, then another. Their presence was quiet but unmistakable. Authority without spectacle. The officer's radio crackled. He didn't answer it. The elderly man turned toward the newcomer. "I would like to leave now," he said. "Of course," came the reply. As they walked toward the sedan, the crowd parted instinctively. Someone whispered, "That's him," mixing with disbelief. The man paused briefly before getting into the car. He looked back at the officer, who stood frozen beside the patrol vehicle, badge heavy on his chest. "This encounter will be reviewed," the man said, not as a threat, but as a statement of fact. "And it will be remembered." The officer nodded again, eyes downcast. The car door closed. The engine started. The sedan pulled back onto the road, disappearing into the lengthening shadows. Behind it, the officer remained standing, surrounded by witnesses, recordings, and the sudden, crushing realization that power had never been his to misuse. And as the last echo of the engine faded, the truth settled fully into the space he had tried to dominate. Justice had been watching all along. Morning came quietly, the way it always did when the world pretended nothing had happened. Sunlight slid through tall windows and settled across polished wood, illuminating a room built for order, not spectacle. The elderly man sat where he always sat, posture straight, hands folded, expression composed. If not for the faint red impressions still visible on his wrists, no one would have guessed he had spent the previous evening on the side of a road, cuffed and questioned like a suspect. Outside those walls, the story had already taken on a life of its own. The footage spread faster than anyone could slow it. Not because it was sensational, but because it was familiar. The shaky phone videos, the raised voice, the quiet dignity of a man who refused to be provoked. Comment sections filled with anger, with sorrow, with recognition. People did not argue about what they saw. They argued about why it kept happening. By midday, statements were issued. Carefully worded. Apologetic without admitting too much. An internal review was announced. Then another. The officer was placed on leave pending investigation. The words were standard, rehearsed, meant to calm a restless public. But calm never comes from procedure alone. Inside a small conference room, the officer sat across from people who did not raise their voices and did not need to. Their questions were precise. Their pauses were deliberate. Every answer he gave echoed against what had been recorded, what had been witnessed, what could not be unsaid. "Why did you escalate the stop?" He shifted in his chair. "I felt challenged." "By what?" He corrected me. A pen paused mid-note. "So your authority was challenged by calm speech?" The officer swallowed. "I thought he was hiding something." "Based on what?" Silence. The room did not rush to fill it. Across the building, the elderly man stood before a packed chamber. He wore the robe not as armor, but as responsibility. When he spoke, the room listened, not because of who he was, but because of what he represented. "This court has long held," he said, voice steady, "that power without accountability is not order. It is chaos wearing a uniform." No one interrupted. No one needed to. He did not mention the roadside. He did not mention the cuffs. He spoke instead of principles, of restraint, of the dangerous ease with which assumption could become action. Each word was measured, but none were accidental. Outside, cameras waited. Inside, history moved forward quietly. The investigation concluded faster than expected. The evidence had been generous. Multiple angles. Clear audio. Clear behavior. There was no room to debate intent when impact stood so plainly on display. The officer was terminated. The announcement did not come with drama. No press conference. No speeches. Just a line in an official release, followed by another line confirming mandatory retraining across the department. For some, it was not enough. For others, it was more than they had expected. The officer packed his locker alone. The metal door creaked softly as he opened it. The badge lay in his hand longer than it should have. It felt heavier now, stripped of the certainty he had once carried so easily. He remembered the man's eyes. Not angry. Not afraid. Disappointed. That memory followed him out the door. Weeks later, the road looked the same. Same bend. Same trees. Same quiet stretch where the stop had occurred. Cars passed without incident. Life continued, as it always did. But something had changed. Officers who drove that route slowed more deliberately. Questions were asked differently. Hands rested farther from holsters. It wasn't policy that caused it. It was awareness. One afternoon, a young officer pulled over a car driven by an elderly man. The officer approached cautiously, professionally. When the window rolled down, the officer greeted him politely, explained the reason for the stop, and thanked him for his time. The elderly man nodded, surprised but appreciative. The stop lasted less than 2 minutes. Back in chambers, the man whose patience had shifted more than one outcome sat reading quietly. A clerk entered, hesitant. "Sir," he said, "there's a letter." The man took it, recognizing the handwriting immediately. He read it slowly. It was not an apology. It did not ask for forgiveness. It was an acknowledgement. Of harm. Of blindness. Of regret too late to change the moment, but not too late to change the man who had caused it. The elderly man folded the letter and placed it carefully in a drawer. He did not smile. He did not frown. He returned to his work. Months later, during a lecture at a law school, a student raised a hand. "How do you respond?" she asked. "When the law fails you personally?" The man considered the question, eyes thoughtful. "The law is written by people," he said. "And people fail. The test is not whether the law is perfect, but whether those entrusted with it are willing to be corrected." Another student asked, "Were you afraid?" He paused. "Just briefly." "No," he said. "But I was aware." That answer lingered long after the lecture ended. The story eventually faded from headlines, replaced by newer ones, louder ones. But it did not disappear. It settled into conversations, into training manuals, into the quiet decisions officers made when choosing how to speak, how to act, how to see. And on that road, under the same open sky, the lesson remained simple and enduring. Respect should never depend on recognition. Because justice does not announce itself with flashing lights. Sometimes, it waits patiently in the back seat, watching to see who you are when you think no one important is watching at all.